All right, let's get into Unit 9 discussions here. So we have national security right there at 1919, the end of World War I, beginning 1920 with what's called the First Red Scare. This episode here is talking about what's going on with Attorney General Palmer and how originally he was one of those voices for reason and saying the Soviet threat wasn't going to be that big of a deal. Yes, it could potentially have some fringe issues and efforts in America, but it wasn't something to create a mass panic over. And then someone bombed his house, and that kind of changed his opinion quite a bit. So Attorney General Palmer is going to establish this anti-radicalism division within his Department of Justice. He appoints J. Edgar Hoover to lead this up with the FBI. In November of 1919, on the second anniversary of the Russian Revolution, Palmer actually ordered raids on radical organizations, and he didn't necessarily obtain search warrants, let alone arrest warrants for anyone. He just raided them. This became known as the beginning of the Palmer Raids. Now, the raids initially turned up very little evidence. One set of blueprints was seized by officers. It turned out to be drawings for a photograph. Palmer had thousands arrested, but had to release most of them. 294 people, exactly 294, were deported without trial back to Finland on a ship named I'm not making this up, the Soviet Ark. In January of 1920, Palmer orders another large raid, this one even bigger, on meeting places for presumed communist organizations in the country. Law enforcement jailed just over 4,000 people, many of them deported. And again, these raids turned up no evidence of bomb making or any serious threat to the country or the well-being of the country either. Now, Palmer appealed to the American public's widespread fear of communism. Like I say, this is the First Red Scare. Fear that he may have shared due to the attack on his home, which, would be reasonable. And some historians actually look at this and they believe that he staged the raids to increase his public profile and thereby improve his chances for a successful presidential run in the future should he choose to pursue something like that, say later 1920 or potentially in 1924. The problem, he oversteps his legal bounds when he predicts that radicals will try to overthrow the government on May 1st, 1920. He put police on high alert throughout the country to stop this impending revolution of communism in America. When nothing happened, a lot of Americans who looked at it, who were already uncomfortable with what Palmer was doing with his raids, and they were kind of afraid of his and the Department of Justice's apparent willingness to just say goodbye to the First Amendment and other civil liberties, they kind of lost interest in him and his tactics. Then a bomb killed 38 people on Wall Street and injured many more in September of that year, 1920. So the public did not place the blame on the radical communist conspiracy. They decided they wanted to see what else was going on. They wanted some fact-finding. By the spring of 1920, most Americans wanted to put the chaos and turmoil of the war behind them. Remember, this is a transitionary moment in American history. This is what ultimately gets Harding elected, is this return to normalcy proposal and campaign slogan of Harding in 1920. Newspaper headlines paid more attention to baseball and fashion than to these threats from abroad, let alone those at home. Communism had failed to run the rampant throughout Europe and the rest of the world, and the fact that communists in America numbered only potentially in the thousands, for the most part, comforted Americans. The threat no longer seemed that great once we were out of the war and we were moving into a more domestic agenda as a country. So there's a lot of change going on, and with the 1920 election itself, Harding, again, on his movement and campaign saying let's go back to normalcy, people were okay with that. They were ready for it, I think. So the priority and I think the focus of the American people at this time in 1920, especially in the later part of 1920 after the dangerous episodes of different bombs and conspiracy theories and the Palmer raids, they really wanted to focus on rebuilding America as a prosperous area. So learning from the lessons of the Gilded Age, applying the reforms and the changes of the Progressive Era, figuring out who we were as a people, but still wanting to have a lot of industrial success and expansion. We wanted to focus as a people on prosperity at home and not necessarily on this active pursuit of anti-communism. So it's important to look back at the Palmer raids in the context of what America was at the end of the First World War, the Great War. The word calls Americans to unite. Remember, this is a time where even German Americans who were a bit hesitant to, openly say, hey, let's go to war with Germany and our German allies and brethren back home until America was finally brought into the war. A lot of people were okay with this idea of uniting as Americans finally. And that had created a really strong nationalism in America. The policies of the CPI, that's the Committee on Public Information, during World War I, especially as more of their dealings came out into the public, really did not make Americans happy. It actually encouraged Americans to be openly suspicious of foreigners and foreign ideas, such as communism and anarchism, which for the most part is fine and dandy as long as that's your personal beliefs and your personal fears. But when it becomes the status quo of the government to make everyone want to fear something, it tends to raise a red flag. Remember that as we go through the 20th century. Radical leftists tended to promote this deeply unpopular anti-war view, and the resentment that Americans felt towards the so-called, at this time, left regime, so this is the unpatriotic groups, it continued throughout the era after the war. So after the Russian Revolution, communism seemed to pose what most people thought, and what a lot in the government, especially the defense agencies, would hope would be this threat to American peace and security. The bombings naturally heightened American fears and gave some credence to this first Red Scare in America. And Palmer encouraged this view, warning that Congress had known people, had actually found evidence that there were communist plots to rise up and destroy the government that the American people knew, and they wanted to do it in one fell swoop. So he contributed to the paranoia that communists and other anarchists were lurking in all segments of society. This is a fear that goes on through the 1920s. We see it with the Sacco and Vanzetti case as well, and it kind of takes the nativism, this kind of racism and antipathy towards foreign people, to new heights. It brings about also in part the rising of the second KKK, or so-called the second coming of it, or the reemergence, whatever you want to call it. But the KKK comes back in the 1920s as a result of the Palmer raids and this national feeling of fear and whatnot. And this time we see almost 5 million people join the Klan. So there's a lot of unintended consequences of it. Like I say, the KKK is one of them, and I'm not to say that's the only reason the Triple K returned. There's a lot to it, but there was most certainly, when you talk about almost 5 million people as membership, it was obviously a popular sentiment to basically be pro-white Protestant individuals who were happy with America how it was. That included maintaining Jim Crow laws. That included maintaining nativist laws. That included a fear of foreigners and this kind of fear of what they might bring to the believed melting pot of America. So it also led to a lot of immigration quotas during the 1920s. The atmosphere of resentment towards foreigners, like I said, is going to impact a really famous trial with Sacco and Vanzetti, where two guys get charged with murder, even though by all means and even firsthand accounts, they were a couple miles away at home. So they got found guilty, and the world media was watching on as the American court system kind of failed freedoms and just basic criminal science at this time. So the judge in the case ends up having very open and very clear bias. Somehow the course wasn't just reset and failed a mistrial, but it happens. And as it happens, the judge actually goes on record saying, just wait until you see what I do to these anarchists blank. They use a pretty strong expletive there. Support for labor unions, also another unintended consequence here. It actually dropped significantly. Business owners take advantage of the public's fears of communism, and they start actually labeling those who want to do labor strikes after the war as Bolsheviks, and it's a Bolshevist revolution, or it's a Bolshevist strike. They call unionism a subversive form of foreign concepts, and the public, of course, is going to take their already heightened fears and unsureness of things, and they start to kind of join on the side of capitalists, which, of course, is going to be great for the middle and upper class in America. But when you're talking on continuing learning from the lessons of the strikes and the unions and the failed capitalism efforts of laissez-faire during the Gilded Age, it kind of sets America back a bit and ends up becoming one of the causes also of the Great Depression. So keep that in mind as we move to the 1930s. Schools in the 1920s are going to require teachers throughout the country to take an oath of loyalty. Doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but you look at some of these oaths and they're pretty strongly worded. Textbooks would be examined and re-examined by supposed experts on patriotism and making sure things are in line with the prevailing ideology of the time. So there was a lot of distrust for schools and teachers as well. So much that pressure groups actually pushed for a patriotic instruction in which teachers would emphasize the greatness of America and not provide any information that just might lead to criticism of its leaders, its past, its policies. And if you think on that, that was also another way that the pro-segregation movement at this time actually uses the education system to kind of reinforce their ideology as well. If you're going to try to criticize Jim Crow laws, well, you might find yourself out of a job and probably beat up or dragged behind a truck or something. So the fear of foreign ideas is also going to make America more isolationist, meaning even though at this point, 1920 and beyond, we're this great country that came out of World War I without any major damage to us. We are the only country that comes out of the Great War as a debtor for other countries. Other people owe us money at this point in time. And we have this unique moment of conscience as a country, I would say, where are we going to do next? What could we do? And we had a lot of options. And for some reason, we end up, because of this hatred of Bolshevism and this fear of the unknown, and because the Senate also is taking a look at the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles is written and saying, no, we don't like that. We're going to be giving away some of our country's sovereignty to other countries. We don't like that at all. America retreats back from being a great world leader and having, we're right there on the cusp, if you look at it in history, in 1920, of really pushing for an end of imperialism, pushing for freedom of the seas, and all these great ideas that Wilson and others had that World War I could have led to, and its conclusion most certainly could have led to. And we kind of retreat instead. So we allow Britain, France, and Russia to kind of have their way with things. And of course, that kind of shoots us in the foot. By appointing J. Edgar and his, friendly cronies in the FBI, and what would found out as the FBI in 1924, this anti-radicalism division under Palmer in the Department of Justice, it leads to a lot of criticism, a lot, and a lot of it rightfully so. Critics that would actually accuse Hoover of just completely ignoring civil rights, ignoring civil liberties, not really differentiating between American citizens and those that might or might not be American citizens. One notable example is Hoover's actually encouraging the FBI to practice monitoring and keeping records on civil rights leaders, and that goes on through the Vietnam War. We're talking 40 and 50 years later, it continues. The Red Scare, this first Red Scare of 1919-1920 is a precursor also for a much later, much deeper, more impassioned second Red Scare that takes place after World War II. And the lingering presence of this Red Scare and fear of communism and what they might do to our system leads a lot of, especially government officials, to maintain an awareness level that I would argue is kind of unhealthy for a government official who's supposed to be legislating and acting on the behest and the favor of their constituents. So when the second Red Scare pops around in the early 1950s, it's a much deeper affair and much more subversive and dangerous. So anyways, that's what I have for you on the national security of this moment in 1919, 1920. Hopefully that helps out, fill out some of your notes on what's going on abroad and also domestically.